You're listening to the Mind Over Murder podcast.
My name is Bill Thomas. I'm a writer, consulting producer, and now podcaster. I am now trying to use my experience as the brother of a murder victim to help other victims of violent crime. I'm working on a book on the unsolved Colonial Parkway Murders, and I'm the co-administrator of the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook group, together with Kristin Dilley.
My name is Kristin Dilley. I'm a writer, a researcher, a teacher, and a victims advocate, as well as the social media manager and co-administrator for the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook page with my partner in crime, Bill Thomas. Welcome to Mind Over Murder. I'm Kristin Dilley.
And I'm Bill Thomas. We'd like to welcome you back to our Mind Over Murder podcast with a little bit of true crime news. Many of you know that we've been following the Kristin Smart case. She's the young woman that disappeared at Cal Poly University in beautiful San Luis Obispo, California, where I have vacationed several times. There was further news in the Kristin Smart disappearance. After a 25-year delay, for reasons that nobody can quite explain, they've moved forward with law enforcement. This would be San Luis Obispo Sheriff's Department, are now searching property owned by Paul Flores. He is the lead suspect in this case. And as a matter of fact, they're now circling back, and law enforcement is referring to Mr. Flores as the lead suspect in this case. This has baffled me for years. There are some very strange stories associated with the Kristin Smart disappearance. Most of them center around Paul Flores as the last person to see Kristin Smart alive. He acknowledges he was with her the night she went missing. One of the strange stories associated with the case is a woman who rented the Flores home after the Kristin Smart disappearance swears that she was awakened repeatedly by what sounded like an alarm clock going off at 4 or 4:30 a.m. every single morning for a period of months, and then it eventually stopped. Now, as it turns out, Kristin Smart, who was a student at Cal Poly, was also a big swimmer, and she worked part-time as a lifeguard at the college pool. And she got up very early because she did the first shift, you know, when people go swimming early in the morning. I just always found it so striking that this possible sound that this tenant was hearing could have been Kristin's watch in the backyard of the Flores home. There have been people agitating for years, 25 years, for them to search the backyard of the Flores home, and they've finally gotten around to a more in-depth search. Interestingly, it wasn't the FBI this time around. It was San Luis Obispo sheriffs headed into the yard with ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs. There was a patio area that was put into that backyard, again, around the time that Kristin Smart disappeared, that I hope they're going to tear out completely and really do a thorough search. I was saying to Kristin the other day, they need to take out every square inch of that concrete and these very large planters that were also placed in the backyard at the same time, and go down 6 feet and just do an exhaustive search, because there have been rumors for years that Kristin Smart's remains may have been placed there. A year ago, around this time, the FBI conducted searches in a number of other locations associated with the Flores family, including in California, Washington State, and a variety of other locations without success. And then they searched computers and other items of interest at Mr. Flores' home in San Pedro, California, which is some distance away. And they also towed away a Volkswagen Rabbit, which is from that era and had been sitting in a non-operational condition in the driveway for some time. And I'm not sure that car had ever been searched before, which, again, I just find the loose ends in this case to be completely baffling. The good news is they do seem to be moving forward with doing additional forensic testing. They are checking out the car, and they towed it away. They are digging in the backyard, and I find it more than a little ironic that the podcast, which has been shedding a lot of light on the Kristin Smart case, is referred to quite deliberately as Your Own Backyard. And we do recommend you take a listen to the podcast. It's very well done. Fingers crossed for some developments in the Kristin Smart case, and we'll certainly let you know if we hear of anything.
Absolutely. We would like to take a moment to ask you to, in addition to writing ratings and reviews, which you've been doing a wonderful job of, thank you so much. We would like to ask your help in helping to sponsor our show financially. Now, we're not asking for tons of money from you because, let's admit it, that stimulus check, while we're happy to have it, is not necessarily going to go as far as we would like it to. But we do have several levels of sponsorship at which you can sponsor our show, starting as low as 99 cents a month, going all the way up to, your entire stimulus check if you would like to send it to us.
Well, that's going a little far, don't you think?
Yeah, maybe just a little bit, but still. There are various levels of sponsorship that do help us pay for the things that we need for this podcast, whether that is equipment or CrimeCon tickets, hotel fees, various other things associated with the podcast that keeps us up and running. So if you are interested in sponsoring the show, we do thank you in advance. And we ask you to go to our Anchor page to learn more about sponsoring Mind Over Murder.
And speaking of spending money, also check out our brand new websites. We have two brand new websites, mindovermurderpodcast.com and colonialparkway.murders.com. Both have new websites. We hope you'll check them out and let us know what you think.
Absolutely. And Bill, I know you've been dying to do this all day because you've been teasing me about it endlessly. So Bill has a very special review that he would like to share, and I'm going to not make him wait anymore to do it. Bill, go ahead and share your review with us, please.
Well, I'd like to read some recent reviews of our podcast and thank everyone for their outstanding reviews. And if you haven't had time, please find a few minutes to give us a 5-star review. And if you can write a review like these reviews, that would be an absolutely wonderful thing. So let me give you a few examples. Great podcast, 5 stars. This is a great information source to keep us aware and hopeful. Keep the awareness alive so justice can be served. And this is from an unpronounceable name. I'm going to try it. It looks like Isaac Kana via Apple Podcasts. Another 5-star review, new listener, 5 stars. I am especially enjoying hearing from family members and experts about the cases covered. The two hosts have an engaging conversational approach.
We try.
That sounds pretty good.
We try, yeah.
And finally, here's my favorite of our new reviews. Excellent listen, exclamation point. 5 stars, writes Doors B via Apple Podcasts. Love these two. One of my favorite new podcasts. I'm enjoying the Colonial Parkway Murders deep dive. Is Kristin Dilley single? ? I want to set her up with my ex-husband! ! LOL. Well, Doors B.
Kristin Dilley is not single. Kristin Dilley has a longtime boyfriend of 10 years. It'll be 10 years in October. But thank you for the thought. Bill actually called me last night and had to read this to me. I'm very flattered, but no, Kristin Dilley is not single. She's got her long-suffering boyfriend who is very, very understanding of when I have to go do my podcasting instead of spending time with him.
Well, my longtime partner, Pamela, whom I mistakenly referred to as my girlfriend on a podcast recently and took a fair amount of static from one of her friends for that. My longtime partner thought this review inquiring about your marital status was the funniest thing she'd ever seen. I think it's very flattering. I'm assuming that if this Dorbsy, I guess you'd say it, wants to hook you up with her ex-husband, I think that must mean she likes her ex-husband as opposed to not liking her ex-husband.
I hope, yeah. So thank you. It's very, very sweet thought, but nope, I've got my long-suffering boyfriend. We are looking forward to bringing you today's episode. This is a deep dive into the murders of Cathy Thomas and Rebecca Dowski. There are definitely a couple of minutes in here where you may want to have a handkerchief ready. Unfortunately, I started crying at the end and got Bill going as well. So we are looking forward to continuing to deep dive our case. And we are going to go ahead and start with these two, Cathy Thomas and Rebecca Dowski. Thank you for listening to Mind Over Murder. We'll see you next time. And we are continuing our deep dive into the Colonial Parkway Murders. We are going to start with the case that is probably nearest and dearest to my partner in crime, Bill Thomas, and that would be regarding his sister, Cathy Thomas, and her girlfriend, Rebecca Dowski. Bill?
This conversation actually predates the expression, the Colonial Parkway Murders. This wasn't called the Colonial Parkway Murders. We're all the way back to 1986, October 9th, 10th, 1986, and the murder of two young women along the Colonial Parkway. But no one is talking about any other murders or even calling the case the Colonial Parkway Murders because such things did not exist at that point.
So we'll go ahead and kick off our discussion here. Bill, what do you know about Cathy and Becky's whereabouts on the night of October 9th? Can you start us there?
October 9th, 1986 is a Thursday night, and as I understand it from talking to Cathy's friends, investigators, and other people, Cathy and Becky were together with two friends of theirs at the College of William and Mary. This foursome, all women, included Cathy's first girlfriend and another Navy friend, as well as Cathy Thomas and Rebecca Dowski. Now, Cathy's first girlfriend and Rebecca Dowski were both taking a class together at the College of William and Mary, and they were working on an assignment with some assistance from their friends that they both had to turn in. If I'm not mistaken, I believe it was the next day. So on this Thursday evening, it's in the fall, the four women worked together on the assignment, and then eventually, sometime after dark, Cathy and Becky announced that they were hungry and that they were going to go get something to eat. So they spun off and headed out in my sister Cathy's white 1980 Honda Civic. Now, as I understand it, the late night dining options, I put quotes around that, in Williamsburg in 1986 were somewhat limited. You're smiling.
Yes, as someone who has lived in Williamsburg for pretty much her entire life, I can confirm. And even up until like the mid-90s, the late night dining options in Williamsburg were a little sparse. And I think you could probably even argue the same now, although there is quite a few bars and restaurants that do cater exclusively to the college kids. But certainly back during 1986, yes, those options would have been quite limited. And I know you and I have spent a good deal of time kind of speculating and trying to figure out, all right, what would have been available back then?
Right.
And not. And we know of some.
Right.
But there are certain things I should probably, it's going to date me. And actually, it's probably going to date you more than it dates me. But I was 5 years old in 1986, so I can't give a great accounting of what life was like in Williamsburg back then.
Oh, like we needed that reminder. All right, so back to Cathy and Becky. We're not 100% certain where they went to get something to eat. We know that after their deaths, an autopsy shows ground beef and lettuce in their systems. That could be anything from like Taco Bell or, something like that to, maybe stew or a burger.
Burgers, yeah.
Tacos at a restaurant. Anything like that, because, you're not going to have a tremendous amount of specificity. You know what the autopsy report reflects. There are unconfirmed reports that Cathy and Becky were seen at the Yorktown pub, which a lot of locals know, and a lot of tourists have been there as well, especially during the day when they're down in the Yorktown area or touring the historic sites. The restaurant had a bit more of a bar scene at night, I understand. I've asked a lot of people, would two women together at the restaurant bar that have engendered a lot of notice? And most people said they didn't think so. Now, it's not a lesbian bar, but keep in mind that in 1986, Cathy and Becky as a same-sex couple would not have engaged in any kind of, public display of affection or anything like that. Gay folks, if they were out and about, as I understand it, had to be pretty careful. And respectfully, I think that part of Virginia is fairly conservative. It's a big military area. Cathy was just getting out of the Navy at that point. She left the Navy a few months before. they wouldn't have necessarily wanted to have been seen hand in hand or anything like that on the William and Mary campus or around Williamsburg.
Now, point of clarification for our listeners. How long had Cathy and Becky been dating at that point?
Cathy and Becky had been introduced by my sister's first girlfriend the previous spring, because we'd been hearing about Rebecca Dowski, or Becky, for 6 months. And they had started dating, had really clicked, and the relationship was going very, very well. So this is Cathy's second romantic relationship with a woman, and Becky's first relationship with a woman that we're aware of. And Cathy had remained close with her first girlfriend, who had provided the introduction and kind of facilitated things. From the sound of it, Cathy was out to my family and was especially close to my younger brother, Jack. Cathy's the youngest, Jack number 2, me number 3, my brother Richard the oldest. Jack's also gay. And so not only are Cathy and Jack the 2 youngest kids, they're a year and 2 weeks apart, so they're almost Irish twins. Mm-hmm. I come from an Irish Catholic family in Boston. And they're extremely close, and they both share this additional bond of being gay and lesbian. So Cathy is out to my family, and my family was very accepting. We were very excited about the new relationship with Becky Dowski. We hadn't yet met her. As a matter of fact, sadly, we were supposed to meet her at Thanksgiving that year. So she was going to come up to Lowell, Massachusetts, my parents' hometown. We were supposed to meet her, hopefully that weekend. So everybody was very excited about it. About 6 months, I think, is about the right time. And the two of them apparently had clicked very nicely. And I think things were going along pretty swimmingly, as my mom would say. It's also interesting to note when we start talking about the other Colonial Parkway murders, and I say this respectfully, Cathy and Becky, the lesbian couple, are really the only serious couple in all of the Colonial Parkway murders. Everybody else, Robin Edwards and David Nobling, had met that day in case number 2 at Ragged Island. Keith Call and Cassandra Haley were on a first date in case number 3, the disappearance. They've never been found. And then in case number 4, Anna Maria Phelps and Daniel Lauer, they're not even really a couple. She's actually his brother Clint's girlfriend, and they're basically traveling companions. So it's funny, we say couples, kind of, but we're using the term very loosely. The truth is the only serious couple in the 4 double homicides is Cathy and Becky. As we understood it, things were going very, very well with the two of them. Becky's a senior at the College of William and Mary, but she lives in the dorms. And again, that whole point about discretion, back then especially, is very important. It's funny, as you know, when we go out and we talk to student groups or at colleges and universities, sometimes they look at me funny, like, because I think things are a lot better now than they used to be in terms of acceptance. People look at gay and lesbian folks like they look at everybody else. They're like, it's no big deal. But it was a big deal back then. Yeah. So Thursday evening, they go to dinner. We know not where. We have all we have are some educated guesses and these unconfirmed reports. 2 women were seen at the Yorktown pub. Mm-hmm. We're not sure it's them. You've got one woman with red hair and bright blue eyes. That's my sister Cathy. And then another very pretty woman with dark wavy hair, and that's Becky's. But, you can't be 100% certain. A waitress said she waited on 2 women in the bar, but we're not 100% certain. As I understand it from friends, these same friends actually that were with them that night, Cathy and Becky had a habit of kicking off the weekends on Thursday night by going to the Colonial Parkway. And supposedly they had a favorite spot. I wish I knew exactly where that was, but I understand it was along the water, and they would park, listen to music, and hang out a little bit. Now, a lot of people have asked me, Cathy's working as a stockbroker, and she's living and working in Virginia Beach. Now, Cathy loved to drive, but if you think about the logistics of a Thursday night date kicking off the weekend, it would be kind of complicated and a lot of driving to go from Williamsburg, drive to Virginia Beach, spend the evening there, or maybe even the night. Yeah. And then if Cathy's going to get to work at her job as a stockbroker in Virginia Beach, and Becky's going to get to class at William and Mary, that means they're going to have to get up really early. Cathy's going to have to drive back from Virginia Beach to Williamsburg, drop Becky off for classes, and then get herself back to Virginia Beach. And Cathy was an early riser, and she started work early. She was a really hard worker. Becky was also a very serious student. These are both very dedicated, hardworking, high-achieving type women. The logistics are kind of a little daunting. It's a lot of time on the road if they do because people have said, well, Cathy was 27 years old, Becky's 21. Why aren't they spending the night at Cathy's apartment in Virginia Beach? Well, if it was a Friday or a Saturday night, as I understand it, they spent the weekend there. That got them away from the college campus, and maybe they could be, a little bit more, have a little bit more alone time. On the Thursday night, that was their routine. And there's one other thing worth mentioning, which is this particular weekend, they were not going to spend the weekend together because it was the start of a little break at Columbus Day. Cathy, the following morning, is noted as missing at her job at the stock brokerage, and Becky is missing, turning in her assignment before supposedly leaving town.
I want to make sure, too, just on a logistics point of view, because I know we have listeners who are not from Virginia. The distance between Williamsburg and Virginia Beach, just like in terms of time getting there, it takes more than an hour to get to Virginia Beach from Williamsburg. And that's if traffic is good, which it rarely is, because you have tunnels to go through and all sorts of things. And Hampton Roads has a tendency to get log jammed in terms of traffic. So I know that we have had people who have said, well, how hard could it be, like you said, to go from Virginia Beach to Williamsburg? The local is here to tell you it can take you a good long time, like up to an hour if traffic is good, but even longer if it's bad. And it generally is not so great.
If you think about the logistics of this Thursday night date night kicking off the weekend, okay, if Cathy and Becky had left William and Mary in Williamsburg and motored an hour to Virginia Beach, at night, traffic might not have been bad.
Yeah.
If they got up really early Friday morning and Cathy drove back out to Williamsburg to drop Becky off, that is iffy from a traffic perspective. And then I think pretty certain, and even when we were shooting the TV show, I ran into some of this traffic. The traffic then turning around and heading back towards Virginia Beach and the Norfolk area, that for sure is going to have heavy traffic. And Cathy,
you're hitting base traffic.
Yeah, exactly. There's all this military traffic and the manufacturing and just there's a lot of people on the road on this Interstate 64. Cathy loved to drive, but her car's a manual transmission. She always drove a stick, and stop and go traffic. All this driving, we've got all this back and forthing. I think that's why they chose the Parkway.
Yeah. We have both of us speculated on where precisely Cathy and Becky's preferred favorite spot would have been. And we have had to do a certain amount of creative sleuthing, both when you've been here in town with the TV series and just on your own, and me on my own, trying to drive out along the 23 miles worth of Parkway and figure out where precisely they were. We do not know, and we've mentioned this a couple of times, but it's worth reiterating again. We do not know the primary crime scene for Cathy and Becky. They were not killed in the car. We know that because there was not enough blood in the car for them to have been killed in the car. But we do not know where that primary crime scene is. So we have no way of knowing where their favorite spots were. But at this point, after Bill and I have worked together for, I think, 6 years at this point, we have some pretty good theories as to where they might have been.
What we do know is that Cathy and Becky go missing essentially Thursday night. By Friday morning, their friends are looking for them. Cathy's first girlfriend, who is taking the class with Becky, makes note of the fact that Becky's not there to turn in her assignment. And the other Navy friend, who worked with Cathy at the stock brokerage in Virginia Beach, makes note of the fact that Cathy's not in the office. Cathy was a stockbroker and was doing very, very well by all accounts. And a stockbroker job is 100% commission. As their friend said to me, and who was the office manager for the company, stockbrokers could come and go as they saw fit. If Cathy didn't want to come in on that Friday or start the long weekend, Columbus Day, early, she had every right to do that. But Cathy was Navy and Naval Academy trained and she's fun and vivacious and bright and funny. She's also super hardworking, and she's been Navy trained. So Cathy Thomas is not the kind of person that's not going to come to work on a Friday and not call in. Now, she could call in and say, hey, I'm taking off early for the weekend. See you Tuesday or whenever the 3-day weekend ended. And she would have no problem whatsoever. But she's not the kind of person that's going to flake out and just not show up at work on Friday. And at the same time, Becky's a really dynamic, hardworking student who takes her studies very seriously. She's a transfer student at William & Mary. She was at Dickinson College in Pennsylvania before. She's a top student. She's a star athlete. She's just somebody who takes things very seriously, like Cathy Thomas. She's not just going to blow off turning in that assignment that they were working on the night before. So that's noted by both the friends, and they think it's very odd. They think to themselves, well, maybe they spun off in Cathy's Honda and decided to go up to D.C. or something, which Cathy very much liked to do. You're listening to Mind Over Murder. We'll be right back after these messages. One of the most frequent questions we're asked here at Mind Over Murder is, how can I help?
Thanks to Othram, a leading forensic DNA testing lab for law enforcement, you can get involved and help solve real cases.
If you have tested at a consumer genetics company, you can contribute your data to DNAsolves.com. The process is easy and confidential. Just 2 simple steps. Your DNA might be the missing piece that helps solve the identity of an unknown person.
Then Mind Over Murder will highlight cases Othram is working on to seek your crowdfunding support for DNA testing to help solve these cold cases.
Upload your DNA profile to DNAsolves.com. It's easy, free, and confidential.
Then join Mind Over Murder as we help families find answers with Othram and DNAsolves.com.
Do you like our show, Mind Over Murder, and want to create your own podcast?
Well then, let us tell you about Anchor.
First of all, it's free. And who doesn't love free, right?
I like free. There's creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer.
You can even add any song from Spotify directly to your episodes. The possibilities are endless for what you can create, whether it's music analysis, your own radio show, or something the world's never heard before.
Anchor will then distribute your podcast for you so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcast, and many more platforms.
And you can even make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership.
I like the sound of that. It's everything you need to make a podcast all in one place. Right here, Anchor.
Download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started on your own podcast.
You can tell them Kristin and Bill from Mind Over Murder sent you. Welcome back to Mind Over Murder. The thing that threw them off, though, is that they look for Becky swinging past her dorm, and they find Becky's car outside the dorm, all packed up for the weekend. Now, the original plan was the 2 women, Cathy and Becky, are not spending the weekend together, as I mentioned, and Becky's supposed to be going up to see some friends at Dickinson in Pennsylvania and then continue on her way to her family's hometown, which is Poughkeepsie, New York. So she was supposed to be spending a couple of days up there and coming back. So then the friends grow increasingly concerned because now they find Becky's car full of her things and no Becky. So Cathy's gone missing, Becky's gone missing. They still don't know if they should be going to law enforcement or anything like that. They're both grown-ups, but it does seem odd. When you get to Sunday then, on Sunday, a passerby, sometimes they've said jogger, sometimes they've said somebody out walking, but someone who's on foot, walking along the grassy banks of the York River next to the Colonial Parkway, this 23-mile-long ribbon of land, is close enough to the water that he can look down the embankment towards the surface of the York River, and he spots the back end of a white Honda. It's over the embankment, rolled down towards the surface of the water, and caught in underbrush. So it's not in the water, and this is key probably. It's out of sight of the Colonial Parkway, which is only about 50 feet away. The road surface is not far away, and the road is patrolled by National Park Service rangers in standard issue cop cars. This is kind of before the whole SUV thing.
Mm-hmm.
So they drove
Crown Vics.
Yeah, they drove Crown Vics or those big Chevy Impalas or whatever those were. But, you know, those big, heavy, four-door American cars that cops have driven for decades. If you think about it from the perspective of the Rangers who patrolled the road and wrote tickets and did all the usual cop stuff, it appears they drove past this Cheatham Annex Overlook site where the car was found dozens of times, it would appear, without spotting the car. So this guy on Sunday who's out of his car walking around, he's closer to the edge of the water, he sees the car. Now remember, this is a pre-internet, pre-cell phone environment. So what do? You drive to the ranger station or wherever the closest phone is, the visitor center, what have you, and he calls in what he thinks is a traffic accident.
So by the time the Rangers actually do get to Cathy's car, what is it that they find when they get there? And what happens with the response to the car? We know that we've had a number of people who have said, and we believe this too, that the response from the Rangers was wholly inadequate. Why were they responding the way that they did? Let's kind of talk a little bit about the response from the park rangers and why some of the decisions were made that they were with regard to how they entered the car.
So the car is called in as a traffic accident. And when the first responder arrives, who's a National Park Service ranger, he makes his way over to the edge of the grassy parking area. It's paved now. Back then it was grass and dirt. So there's no curb or anything. So it's actually possible, and cars often did pull up on the grass and look at the river or whatever. As he makes his way towards the car, he can see that it's rolled down the embankment and become wedged in this underbrush. It hasn't made its way to the surface of the water. He goes over to the car, as we understand it, and then he's attempting to open the side doors. It's a two-door, small, white Honda. He cannot open the doors because they're wedged in tight against the underbrush, which is pretty thick at that point. So then he's trying to peer through the windows to see what's going on. Remember, it's been called in as a traffic accident. He sees two women inside the car, and apparently he believes that the women are trapped inside the car. So he makes the, in retrospect, very unfortunate decision to smash the back window of the Honda Civic, likely with a nightstick or something like that. He smashes the back window, which is, that big, large glass hatchback, which obviously could have potentially had fingerprints or other evidence on it. Mm-hmm. He smashes the back window, which then shatters the interior of the car with broken glass. And he immediately smells a very strong petroleum smell, the smell of fuel inside the car. And he is attempting to then get a better look at the two people that are inside. Now, Cathy, my sister, who is 5'7", 145 pounds, so she's not a tiny person, is wedged in the hatchback area under that glass and is kind of in a seated position. Would have required a fair amount of strength to pick someone up and place them this way. Mm-hmm. And then Becky is in the back seat, kind of on the diagonal, with her feet extending towards the passenger door. Some of the photographs we've seen were originally slides, and they seem to have reversed the image. So in some photographs, it sometimes looks like Becky's feet are towards the passenger door, or rather the driver's door, rather than the passenger's door. But I'm pretty sure it's the passenger door. Now, by this point, it's pretty clear that this isn't a traffic accident, and that these women have been murdered because of the condition of their bodies. Their throats have clearly been cut. There's a lot of blood, and the ranger realizes, okay, we're not dealing with a traffic accident here. He calls it in, I would imagine, on his radio, and then additional personnel begin to arrive. Now, they are not able to get the women out of the car until a tow truck arrives and then hooks onto there's a little loop on the back of the Honda on the underside of the chassis. You can see in some photographs that they've attached a cable and pulled the car back up onto the grassy parking area. At that point, first responders, who are firefighters / EMTs enter the car and examine the bodies. People who are looking at this through a 2021 perspective will groan because they're like, what are they doing? But you have to remember, this is 1986. Crime scenes are not secured in the same way in 1986 than they would be in 2021, 34 years later. I've even spoken to the EMTs who responded. They climbed into the car with the bodies to examine Cathy and Becky's bodies. Without getting too graphic, it's very clear when I've talked to these EMTs that it was a terrible scene inside the car with a limited amount of blood, but still a pretty ghastly scene. And then this very strong smell of what they initially identified as kerosene or diesel fuel. These days they say diesel fuel a lot, but back in the day when it first happened, they said kerosene. Ultimately, then, a number of agencies respond and kind of surround the vehicle. And again, this wouldn't happen in 2021, but it did happen in 1986. I know there's some potential for unintentional destroying of evidence, and this was how things were done back in the 80s.
Yeah. Let's, while we're on the subject, let's go ahead and talk a little bit about the thing that came up a lot in the Lover's Lane murders, but we'll go ahead and say it here for people who may not have had a chance to watch the series, which you should, by the way, go watch. Talk about Cathy and Becky's wallets and purses, please, as well as anything else that was in the car that's of note.
There doesn't appear to be any robbery because Cathy and Becky both had money in their wallets. Cathy had kind of a larger purse. My brother Jack jokingly called it an old lady purse. Jack thought it looked like something our mom, Evelyn, would have carried. I don't know. I don't pay a lot of attention to women's purses, but some things that were striking were that Cathy's wallet appeared to be open. There was money inside the wallet, so there's no robbery. Other things that were striking about the interior of the car, there was a church flyer. We were raised Catholic, but this is from the Alamo Christian Church, which is very big in that area at that time. It seemed out of place. And the interior of the car was kind of messy inside, which Cathy was kind of a neatneck. So the interior of the car looked like it had kind of been trashed a bit. There's always been a lot of question about how far back the seat was moved. Because it does appear that the offender likely killed Cathy and Becky elsewhere because there wasn't enough blood inside the car for the murders to have taken place. And this is a pretty small car on top of everything else. And that their bodies were placed inside the car and that the offender then drove the car with Cathy's body in the way back and Becky's body in the back seat to this Cheetah Mannix overlook where he or she, I think we can say he pretty safely, stopped the car and then made an attempt, it appears based on matches found in the grassy area, made an attempt to set the car on fire. And this has always been one of the big curiosities here. How is it you are trying to set a car on fire using diesel fuel? Those of you that know anything about the ignition properties of diesel fuel, I'm not an expert, know that it won't light with a match. Now, whether the offender thought they had been given gasoline or had taken gasoline from somewhere, or whether they thought they could get the diesel fuel or kerosene to light with a match, it was unsuccessful. Ultimately, having failed to set the car on fire, they pushed the car over the embankment down towards the surface of the water where it got caught in the underbrush. They're going to substantial lengths to hide evidence and hide the bodies. Somewhere prior to all of this, they had likely gotten Cathy and Becky out of the car, and they had used restraints to tie their wrists. They had used a rope then to strangle them, likely from behind, and then ultimately, while their hearts were still beating, cut their throats from beyond ear to ear. Cathy's essentially decapitated. There's a sense of overkill in how the murders actually took place. And as you mentioned, Kristin, sadly, we don't know where the murders took place.
Yep.
The FBI investigators believe that the murders took place elsewhere on the parkway. but we don't know exactly where. So what we end up with is a scene that's a dump site where a car and 2 women's bodies are found inside, but not, as far as we know, the place where the attacks actually took place. That appears to be elsewhere, and there are 2 closed, much more private picnic areas that were open back then but are closed now that are less than a mile in either direction from the Cheatham Annex Overlook where the car is found. And they, to me and to the FBI investigators, seem like much more likely places. If the crime took place along the Colonial Parkway, it appears that the crime took place, and then there's this movement of the car, as we talked about, and then this attempt to set the car on fire, and then failing that, pushing the car over the embankment. The offender didn't succeed in placing the car in the York River, which is actually quite wide and deep, as you know.
Yes.
At that location. But in one way, they got lucky in that the car was hidden from view, we think, for close to 3 days, 2.5 days, sometime late Thursday night to Sunday afternoon. So 2.5, almost 3 days.
2.5, almost 3 days. Let's take a minute and sort of address the sense of time and place here. The Colonial Parkway of the 1980s was very much not the Colonial Parkway of today. As somebody who drives the Parkway every day to get home from work, it is a very active spot. On nice days, there are people out there swimming, fishing, sailing, crabbing, hiking, running, biking, you name it, it's there. And I have no doubt that was probably true in the 80s as well, but certainly the Colonial Parkway at night of the 1980s was a very different spot. Bill, do you want to speak to that a little bit?
Well, as we understand it from talking to law enforcement, the Colonial Parkway, which is this 23-mile-long ribbon of land along 2 rivers, the James and York Rivers, it's absolutely beautiful. As you're mentioning, though, during the day, a lot of tourists, a lot of people driving from these historic sites, Jamestown, Yorktown, Colonial Williamsburg. And the road is made by the National Park Service in the 30s and 40s to connect these historic sites. So it's designed to feel like this old-fashioned highway. Now, interestingly, it has no lights. No traffic lights. It has no nothing. It's designed to look like an old-fashioned kind of country highway. So that's very charming during the day. At night, it's very beautiful, but it's really remote. And it's pitch black out there because there are no city lights, no traffic lights, no businesses of any type. And there's only, I don't know, I'm ballparking here, but what do you think? Maybe 7 entrances and exits over 23 miles? Yeah, definitely. From the area that we're talking about with Cathy and Becky coming on from, the Williamsburg area all the way up to Yorktown at the battlefield, there are maybe 3 places where you can get on and get off. So yeah, definitely. So once you're on, you're kind of on. And the road is actually quite narrow because usually the river's on one side and then you can't always see it, but there's often a fence a few hundred yards into the woods on the land side of the road. So it's designed to be this scenic parkway, and it's absolutely beautiful. At night, it takes on a completely different character. Local kids, and we've talked to the other families, they said that at night, because it was so lightly patrolled, and one longtime deputy sheriff said to us, it was basically the Wild West out there. And
I love that quote, yeah.
And he said at another time sitting with me, he said, Bill, if people had any idea how lightly patrolled the Colonial Parkway was at night, they would have never gone out there because a lot of stuff happened out there because it was so lightly patrolled. So you had couples out there doing the parking thing. You had drug deals. You had kids going to party. I know Joyce Call Canada, who'll be guesting with us in a couple of weeks. She said that her friends, they knew they could go there and party, and every once in a while the Rangers would come along and tell them to move along and that sort of thing. But she said, they'd be out there drinking beer and smoking pot, and couples would be, making out and that kind of stuff. It was just kind of this Wild West atmosphere. I don't think that was necessarily what would have attracted Cathy and Becky to that location. But the truth is, you could go out there, and if you wanted to be alone, you could really be alone. Now, remember, too, Cathy loves to drive. And she loves to drive. She had a little bit of a heavy foot, maybe got a couple of tickets. She had a red Honda CRX and a white Honda Civic. And man, she liked to drive those curvy roads, and she'd be zooming along and, listening to music. And Cyndi Lauper was very big at that point, and Joan Armatrading, and the Torch album by Carly Simon was very big. These were all cassettes that were found in Cathy's car. And I knew that, she loved a lot of these artists. So, motoring along and listening to music and, maybe stopping at a favorite spot and being romantic. This all makes perfect sense to me. Now, are they out there to party? I mean, they might have smoked pot. They were not big drinkers or big druggies or anything like that. But I could see the scenic beauty and maybe even the remote quality of the Colonial Parkway as being very appealing. And supposedly they had a very pretty spot along the water that they really liked that was a bit isolated, so they could sit and talk and be romantic. It all makes some sense. The way this starts for me as the brother is that on Sunday afternoon, I got a call from my parents. They're up in Lowell, Massachusetts, our hometown. I remember the phone rang. I was living in Philadelphia working for RCA Video at the time. It was a Sunday afternoon, is my recollection. The phone rang. It was my parents, both my mom and dad. And I come from this very, close Irish Catholic family from Boston. So not unusual to hear from my parents. And we certainly would talk at least once a week, sometimes more often. Phone rings. It's my mom and dad. Not unusual. There was something about my father's tone that was so serious right from the get-go. And I remember him saying, "Are you sitting down?" And I was thinking, what do I need to be sitting down for? I mean, what is this? My dad did most of the talking, which was not unusual. My mom was kind of quiet. He started to tell me that our sister Cathy, the youngest of four, and the only girl, had been murdered on a place called the Colonial Parkway, which I'd never heard of, in Virginia, not far from Williamsburg. And I knew her girlfriend went to school there, and she knew Williamsburg. They weren't sure what they were doing there, but Cathy and Becky had been found that afternoon in Cathy's Honda. I remember my dad saying Cheatham Annex, and it overlooked a naval facility. Keep in mind, we're a Navy family. My dad described it, and he said it was an FBI case because if you are killed in a national park, the FBI is the lead agency in that investigation. And I remember we thought that was a good thing because of our respect for the FBI. My dad told me everything that they knew, which wasn't too terribly much, and that he was in touch with an FBI investigator and that they're getting to the bottom of this thing. Now, it's one of those things where, you hear the words coming out of the telephone. And again, remember, this is before cell phones, before the internet. I know this sounds like a million years ago. It was only 34 years ago. Sometimes when we talk to the schools and universities, they look at me like I'm from Mars. Like there was no cell phone. Did you look?
Whatever did you do?
Did you look that up on the computer? But I remember thinking it was so difficult to grasp the idea that Cathy, this amazing, vibrant, wonderful sister of ours, was gone, and that it had happened in this bizarre way. And that kind of starts to sink in that, you're never going to see your sister again. The whole thing is just so difficult to initially to absorb. It's, you just hear the words and you understand them, but you don't really you can't really quite get your hand around what it is that, in this case, my dad was saying. It occurred to me years later in talking about this that my parents had to make the same phone call 3 times in a row, and how difficult that must have been. They talked to my older brother, Richard, who was a Navy doctor and was living in Hawaii at that time with his wife and their 2 little boys, and then me. And then they were trying to reach my younger brother, Jack, who was living in New York City and working for the Schubert organization, the theatrical producers. And they actually weren't able to find Jack. He was out with friends. And again, before cell phones, as I've explained, back then you called someone at work or at home. If you were lucky, they had an answering machine. That was right. That was high tech back then. So if you wanted to reach 5-year-old Kristin, I joke, but you would call either work or home. and you'd leave a message. And if you didn't get them, that was it. So they didn't get Jack until the next morning at the Schubert organization. My family had agreed that we were going to meet up in Massachusetts at my family's home up in Lowell and kind of figure out next steps. And so I think it was the next morning I made arrangements to pack up my Volkswagen Rabbit GTI with some clothes and headed north from Philadelphia, where I was living, to New York City. My recollection is that I spent the night at my brother Jack's apartment, and we went out with some friends that night, just like completely shell-shocked, talking about what had happened. You're just trying to understand, and it's so difficult. And at this point, you're just kind of numb. You understand that this thing has happened, but you're not really completely understanding the long-term ramifications of what has happened. And then we got up the next morning. We drove up from New York to Lowell, Massachusetts, which is about a 4-hour drive, and just talking the whole way about Cathy and about the impact on the family. And we weren't quite sure what to expect with Mom and Dad. We talked to them on the phone a couple of times, but, there's no way to talk from the car, anything like that. I remember we pulled into the driveway of my parents' house up in Lowell, Massachusetts, and went inside, and long, long hugs and a lot of tears. I remember one of the things I realized very quickly, right from the word go, was I could feel the wagons being circled, the Thomas family wagons. I came from this very close family, and my dad had been a naval officer. My older brother Richard was a naval officer. Cathy graduated from the Naval Academy as well. We'd moved around a lot. You're always the new kid in school, the 4 kids, my mom and dad. So you kind of had this very tight unit. You would move every other summer, but you always had each other. And the 4 kids, you always had each other's back. And then when you got there that summer, you hung out with your brothers and your sister. When you got to school that fall, then you'd start to you might meet some kids in the neighborhood and so on. But, really you'd meet more kids when you got to school in the fall. That idea was the 4 kids and mom and dad kind of against the world, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
I could feel the wagons being circled as soon as we got there. So I remember my mom and dad talking to my older brother, Richard, asking him to fly from Hawaii to Virginia to go and identify my sister's body, which my parents were so devastated. They were not in a position to do that. And so my older brother, Richard, God love him, was given the very sad task of identifying Cathy's body. And we'll talk about what happened after that next time. Barriers were going up in Lowell. We were fending off the outside world. I was already beginning to realize that much like 9/11 or the Challenger disaster, or for people of my generation, when I was a little kid, John F. Kennedy was killed, and there are other lines of demarcation, I began to realize that Cathy's death would now begin to mark everything that came before and everything that came after. And it became like our own private 9/11.
Thanks for listening to Mind Over Murder. We'll see you next episode.
Mind Over Murder is a production of Absolute Zero and Another Dog Productions.
Our executive producers are Bill Thomas and Kristin Dilley.
Our logo art is by Pamela Arnois.
Our theme music is by Kevin MacLeod.
Mind Over Murder is distributed in partnership with Crawl Space Media.
You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram.
You can also follow our page on the Colonial Parkway Murders on Facebook.
And finally, you can follow Bill Thomas on Twitter at BillThomas56.
Thank you for listening to Mind Over Murder.